Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Hello and welcome to the course on Indian Poetics. This is Bhakti Vaishnav, and again we are going to discuss the constituent elements of Indian Poetics as a part of our course. Now in the first lecture we discussed about the concepts that have governed Indian Poetics over centuries, and today we are going to discuss the sub-constituent elements of this major constituent elements of Indian Poetics. So we are going to discuss about various schools that we have already discussed. That Rasa school is the one which discusses the emotive expression. Dhwani school is the one which connotes indirect or suggestive expression. We also discussed about Vakrokti, which means which relates to style in general, and it puts more emphasis on structured expressions in particular. Alankara as a school discusses and focuses more on the importance of figurative speech of expression as part of poetry as major important vital Alankara emphasizes on figurative speech or expression as major element of poetry or as a yardstick for studying or analyzing poetic qualities in a poetry. Riti as a school emphasized more on style. So as we go further, we will see that this constituent elements or major schools have their thinkers who emphasize on various aspects. They have also categorized sub aspects, they have given their definitions, and also how over centuries thinkers have discussed and evolved these schools in various manner, and how it has evolved over a period of time, and how we have reached our modern time in which we discuss the modern Indian poetics. So, as we discussed in the 6th or 7th century, Bharat Muni in his Natya Shastra, especially in Rasa Adhyaya and Bhava Adhyaya, has explicated the concept of Bhav and Ras, which later became as the principles for all deliberations of Indian aesthetics. So, poetry has been defined as Rasatmakam Vakyam Kavyam. By Bharat, Ras has been defined as poetry has been defined as rasatmakam kavyam poetry has been defined as rasatmakam vakyam kavyam by Bharat, and this shows Bharat Muni's emphasis on the quality of poetry, the essence of poetry as lies in the ras that it leads to. Now, talking about ras, we also know that Ras Siddhanta says that a work of poetry or drama is expressed through emotive meanings and essentially an emotive discourse. Ras Siddhanta clearly says that poetry is must have an emotive meaning, and it also in a sense is an emotional discourse. Now this emotional discourse concerns itself with the portrayal of human feelings and attitude. Emotions are manifested in poetry as in life by a combination of various factors depending on the situation. In this way, poetry is entirely different from a philosophical or spiritual treatise, which necessarily deals with the ideas or concepts. Now here this concept also comes very close to what the contemporary Western discourses have talked about in terms of expressionism. the emotional or psychological effect on the beholder or the reader or the appreciator is more important according to Ras Siddhanta. So, Rasa Sutra defines it as तत्र विभाव अनुभाव व्याभिचारी संयोगात निष्पतितः is what ras is. Ras is created by a combination or commingling of vibhav, anubhav and sanchari bhav, which means it is maturing, accomplishment and consummation of ras takes place, then only the ras can be relished. The poetry can be relished when this ras is created or secreted. Now, this aesthetic delight is created through a proper or harmonious blending of vibhav, anubhav and vyabhichari bhav. This leads to necessary, we have to discuss what is the necessary conditions for evocation of rasa. The necessary condition of evocation of rasa is, as discussed, a combination or commingling of these causes, which means vibhavs, symptoms, which means anubhavs, and ancillary feelings, which means vyabhicharins or vyabhichari bhav, and their conjunction in a proper manner or sanyog. Sanyog is the key word. It is not just any kind of combination, it has to be a sanyog, it has to be mixed and commingled properly, which leads to this relish of the element of rasa in a given poetry. Now, these are the types of rasa. We know in Indian culture we talk about Nav Ras. So, this Nav Ras are Shrungar, Veer, Karuna, Adbhut, Hasya, Bhayanak, Bibhats, Raudra, Shanta, Rasa, Nava, Prakirtita. This is what Bharat defines, that Shringar, which is amorous, Hasya means comic, Karuna means compassionate, Raudra means furious, Veer means heroic, Bhayankar means fearful, Bibhatsa means odious, Adbhut means marvelous, Shant means serenity, and those who have paid attention to the poster of this course or our first slide that comes, you would have seen that the rasa is presented there in the first slide itself. So, you can actually see the ras in manifestation through the form of dance, in our slides. Navrasa were given by Bharat, and with the time Vatsalya and Bhakti were added by the later exponents of Rasa school. Moving on to the next school of Indian poetics is Alankara. We know that Bhama had established this concept or the school of Alankar, and that was through his elaborated work on Alankar titled as Kavya Alankar, and therein he discusses 35 figures of speech. Later on, Udbhat and Rudrat, they are chief two major contributors who discussed and focused on the elements of alankaras and types of alankaras, and they elaborated and exemplified alankars in Sanskrit poetry. So, they elaborated on this 35 figures of speech given by Bhama, and they took it even further and added to the system of or the school of Alankara through their discussion. Now, Alankaras can be of two types. They can be Arth Alankara and then they can be Shabda Alankara. So, Arth Alankara can be Vastav, Anupamai, Astitya and Shlesh, whereas in Shabda Alankara you can have Swad, Shlesh again, Chitra, Yamak and Anupras. Alankara Savasva of Ruyaka and Alankara Kaustubh of Vishweshwara are also important texts or major contributions that we have to refer to when we are discussing Alankara. Very important, also another equally important contributor is Appaya Dikshita, where has discussed his theory of Alankara in his work as well. Appaya Dikshit for us is probably more known for his Bhatti Kavya, but he is also as a major exponent of Alankara school, and though he was a poet, he has contributed to the theory part also, and his practice also exemplifies his belief and his it's like theory in praxis. So Bhatti Kavya is also it discusses the story or narrates a story in verse, and it also supplies plenty of rules of examples of rules of grammar and poetics, and he devoted considerable attention to the entire set of alankaras in the vogue of at that time. So Bhatti Kavya becomes very important as a text to be studied or referred to for Alankar theory in praxis. Alankara means in its essence ornamentation. Over a period of time, this term underwent several changes within the course of time, as I already said. At first, it was a generic term for ordinary figures of speech, of sound, such as upma, rupak and yamak. What we designate by the term Alankar today, we generally in our sense, in our studies, we have come across this word of figures of, various types of figures of speech. So rupak and upma are very familiar to us. By the time Dandin, the term Alankar acquired a more extensive meaning and had come to designate any factor that produces poetic beauty, kavya shobha. Under this wide concept, everything that brought about poetic appeal or kavya gunas, as they said, could be introduced as Alankara. Vamana used the term synonymously with the entire beauty in poetry. So when Vamana discusses Alankara, he is also talking about the entire beauty of the poetry. So the entire saundarya of the kavya is synonymous to Vaman as Alankara is. Poetry as having a body, we know that Rajshekhar has also discussed this Kavya Purush. So poetry is also understood as Kavya Sharir, which needs ornamentation. So for this Alankarins, the theorist of Alankara, the body constituted of two basic elements. One is sound and one is sense. So Shabda and Artha, as we discussed, became the chief elements on the basis of which the Alankars are classified. According to Bhama, Kavya was the combination of these two elements. So Kavya has to have a body which requires ornamentation. A combination of these two for Bhama had became a Kavya. But this Kavya Sharira of poetry never shines without proper ornamentation, as Bhama has said. So in the form of poetic figures, and hence they ornament or add to the beauty of the poetry as a form of poetic figures, and that is why they become very essential. Just as the face of a damsel, though can be beautiful, lacks luster if they are unadorned, and so is the case of poetry. That is what these people, the practitioner of Alankara school, seem to suggest. Riti school paid more attention to the style. Acharya Vamana was the founder of this theory, and he declared that the Riti is the soul of the poetry. He makes his statement more clear, or rather clearer, by saying that the word Shabda and its artha constitute the body, of which the soul is the Riti. How he defines Riti as Vishishta Pad Rachna, or a particular arrangement of words. he classifies Riti into these major segments: Vedarbi style, Panchali style or Gondi style. Lati style was also added. Vedarbi possesses all 10 gunas. Gaudi style possesses the 2 ojas and kanti gunas, and they possess these gunas are also elaborated upon by the practitioners. So each riti, Vedarbhi, Panchali and Gaudi have their respective gunas, and they are essential for becoming for a poetry to become poetry, for becoming kavyat in its true sense. These gunas were required. That is what the practitioners of Riti school emphasized upon. Now these are the Shabda Gunas. So Shabda Guna is basically synonymous to something as excellence of sound. So you have Ojas, Prasad, Samata, Samadhi, Madhurya, Sokomarya and Arthvyakti along with Kanti that define that have been defined by these practitioners as part of gunas that are required to create a proper style. Arth guna are again ojas, that is Slesh, there is Samta, Samadhi, Madhurya, Sokomarya, Udarta and Kanti. Balance of these two are required to create a proper style, proper riti. So practitioner of Vedarbi has to have been studied or analyzed on the basis of what are the major gunas that have been practiced by practitioner of a Vedarbi style. So it is like, so this kind, each riti has been analyzed and studied on the basis of the gunas that they employ to generate poetry in its true sense, and they have been analyzed and discussed by this practitioner with respect to this divisions and classification of guna and their respective riti. Coming to Dhwani, the school of Dhwani is not unknown to us, and we know that it means that there is a suggestive quality in poetic language. School of Dhwani was headed by Anandvardhan. He points out that it is not the literal or simple or direct or referential meaning that poetry properly expresses, but it is suggestive, indirect and emotive meaning that makes poetry in its true sense. So therefore, through the words of a poem must be given their due importance, and the same with regard to the literal sense that they denote. So there is the poet chooses the words which have to have that ability to denote and connote and imply something, to suggest something. So Dhwani goes beyond the denotative meaning and the connotative meaning, and it pays more attention to the suggestion, the ability to make the suggestive ability to employ suggestive language. That is the chief preoccupation and focus of the practitioners of Dhwani school. The theory proposed in Dhwanyalok by Anandvardhan is known as the name Dhwani. We already know about it, and Dhwanyaloka is itself a huge compendium of poetry and poetics. The theory of Dhwani came to light around 9th century and dominated Indian poetics from 9th to 12th century. Acharya Abhinav Gupta wrote an elaborate and authoritative commentary on Dhwanyaloka, and which again brought Dhwani as a chief school of Indian poetics in the center. They said that feeling cannot be objectively brought to consciousness by liberal expression or vakya, and that it can be made an object of direct expression only through indirect expression, through vyangya. So vakya has to have a vyangya, then only it can become poetry. There is not a single specimen of good poetry appealing to a man of taste. which does not owe all its beauty to the play of suggestion. And this should be considered as the supreme secret of poetry. This is what they emphasized upon. Now, the three elements of Dhwani are Abhida, Lakshana and Vyanjana. Now, when we talk about this suggestiveness of poetry or the poetic element of suggestiveness, what they mean is that, for example, if we take an example of something like a village on the banks of Ganga, so for it becomes the Vakya. This is a simple Vakya which also has a denotation is that a village situated on a river, but when you go into the connotation or the suggestiveness or the implied meaning, for a non-Hindu it might be a simple denotation of a village that is sent upon a bank of a river, but for a person who knows Indian culture or who knows about Indian Hindu philosophy and practices, the village on the banks of Ganga will also suggest purity, holiness and cultural practices, and it will also evoke many of the cultural values. So, this is the suggestive ability or suggestive capacity of the words, and that what makes this village on Ganga used of such a kind makes it poetic with the use of Dhwani. Coming to the school of Vakrokti, Kuntaka, who has been the founder and the major exponent of this school, and he has defined it as a vital essence of poetry. Vakrokti Kavya Jivitam. He says that it is the essence, vital essence of poetry, and we need to have Vakrokti in poetry to make it truly poetic. Certain striking or charming vichitra or mode of expression, vinyasa karma, which is different from and excels from common or matter of fact expressions, maybe in common practices or common parlance or scientific discourses. The point of Vakrokti or the idea of Vakrokti is that it is a certain charming duration from the ordinary mode of expression of ideas. It constitutes, according to Kuntak, the soul of poetry. This Vakrokti constitutes the soul of poetry. He further describes Vakrokti as a striking denotion, Vichitra and Abhida, and conceives of it as a striking mode of expression depending on the particular turn given to it by the skill of the poet. So here the skill of poetry is lies in, or the ability of poetry or poetic quality of poetry is judged by its capacity to give or expression through a mode of turning it, giving it a proper turn, and both the words and meanings are to be embellished, and their embellishment lies in their obliqueness. How oblique is the word or its meaning decides the capacity, how well it is made to be oblique decides the quality of the poetry according to Kuntak. An ingenious utterance peculiar to poetry and it's distinct from popular usage. It is also cleaner turn of speech, it's witty and it must have witty and startling effect. These are the characteristics of Vakrokti, that it must be different and distinct from popular usage. So, it cannot be a colloquial language just used for communication. Simple language of day-to-day communication cannot become poetry, and that is why it is also not Vakrokti, and Vakrokti must have a sudden turn of speech and must have witty and startling effect. Then comes the school. After Vakrokti, we need to discuss the school of Auchitya. founded and practiced by Kshemendra, he explains the term Auchitya in the following way: that which is suited to a certain thing is called proper, Uchita, the abstract notion of which is Auchitya. Propriety between Angin and Ang. Propriety is perfect harmony according to Kshemendra. Auchitya is the condition of being proper when one thing befits another or when things suit each other well and match perfectly. They may be said to be proper or appropriate. Such matching or fitting qualifies or is the quality of Auchitya. Auchitya is about proportion and it is also about harmony on one side and appropriateness and adaptation on the other side. It cannot be understood by itself but presupposes that to which all other things are harmonious or and appropriate. So, pad, vakya, prabandhata, that is composition, guna, figures of speech, ras, kriya, karaka, linga, vachana, vishesha, upsarga, nipata, kala, desha, kula, vritti, tattva, abhipraya, sattva, swabhav and pratibha, vichar and naam. All these elements have to have this balance of proportion and harmony. It must be appropriate and adapted to suit the entire thing. It must fit into it in a properity. It must fit in a proper manner. That is what is emphasized by Kshemendra. Next is very important practitioner of poetry from modern times. We need to discuss him because he is the one who blends ancient Indian plus the discourse and the poetry and theory of West. He had digested and he had come forward with his own new theory that suited his time, and he is so much relevant to us till today that he becomes the part of modern Indian poetics. We are talking about nobody else but Sri Aurobindo. His letters on poetry and art, which is part of his volume 27 of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo, is the material which talks about his views on Indian poetry and Indian poetics. It is the material from the earlier collection of by him, which was titled as Letters on Poetry, Literature and Art, Letters on Savitri and on himself. In all, there are more than 500 letters which constitute or which put together give us an insight on Sri Aurobindo's interest or insights on poetry or poetics as such, wherein he has dwelt on the subject relating to the arts, especially poetry. It ranges from poetic creation to sources of inspiration, to technique, to artistry, to rhythm, style, diction, form, as well as disciplinary concerns like sadhana, reading, writing, language and yoga. There are also attempts at synthesis like reading and sadhana, writing and sadhana, poetry and sadhana, and language and study related with yoga. Sri Aurobindo constructs a triad starting with the romantic poets. In his letter, all these letters he kind of creates a triad. In the first triad is the romantic poets tradition, and he says it is an instinctive field of consciousness that occupies the individual at the level of body. So, romantic poets tradition is more instinctive, and it is the first triad in which the poetry manifests as at the level of body. In the second triad, he takes it further and makes it at the level of intelligence, and what he says that it is a more evolved triad and is the classical tradition that corresponds to the intelligent field of consciousness, and it occupies the individual at the level of mind. We know Aurobindo's practice and notion on this theory of man in evolution, and that is why his theory of poetry also has a resemblance of his philosophy. So, the third triad wherein he discusses the level of intuitiveness, he is actually going to the highest triadic relationship which would be the real tradition that emerges out of the intuitive field of consciousness and also combines with intelligence, and it is a kind, and mind, body and intuitiveness combine, and they correspond to this yogic stage of evolution of individual poet. So, the poet when he reaches or attains the yogic stage, that is his final evolution, stage of evolution as a poet according to Sri Aurobindo. His theory of poetry is based on three guiding principles. The theory of poetry outlined by Sri Aurobindo himself. Then he is also the second guiding principle for him or given by him is the evaluation of English poetry, by which Sri Aurobindo means that poetry by the English poets. He has given evaluation of English poetry, and thereby he has given his notions of poetics in general. And the third one is the future of poetry, which he calls the future of poetry or the future poetry. The future of poetry according to Aurobindo is about the poetry of the future, where he determines the role of the poet as the conductor or the medium for the meeting of the individual mind with the universal mind that brings about the evolution of consciousness. So, the poetry creation and the role of the poet has been defined by Aurobindo as when the source of inspiration is in the heart of the psychic, there is more easily a goodwill in the vital channel. The flow is spontaneous, the inspiration takes at once its true form, and speech and it is transmitted without any interference or only a minimum of interference by the brain mind, that great spoiler of the higher or deeper splendors. The poet labors in anguish to get the one true word, the authentic rhythm, the real divine substance of what he has to say, while all the time it is waiting complete and ready behind, but it is denied free transmission by some part of the transmitting agency which prefers to translate and is not willing to merely to receive and transcribe. There have been attempts by people, and people have made studies to find out the relation, or there have been comparative studies on Aurobindo's future of poetry or his notion on future poetry, and what T.S. Eliot has suggested as a concept in tradition and individual talent. But we have to pay focus or pay attention to the fact that Aurobindo's future poetry has deep roots, and it is immensely rooted in the notion of his philosophy on yoga and sadhana and the concept of universal mind and human mind. So, for him the poet attains his final stage through avoiding his interference of mind and body and trying to be intuitive and being one with the universal mind, and attaining the highest form of evolution that is required of a poet. So, that is in all that we have to discuss about the constituent elements of poetry or Indian poetics, and we are going to discuss about the further elements of Indian poetics in coming lectures. Thank you all.